back, everyone. You ready to go today? Righto, let's get into it. So we're going to go down to the lost city of Petra, the rose-red city, half as old as time. Now, it's located in what country? Jordan, that's right. So it ought to be on your bucket list to go and visit, go to Jordan. And when I visited this site, and I've had the privilege of going there 4 times, I literally saw prophecy carved in stone. Now here's a map, shows the location of Petra, and on both occasions, on every occasion that I visited there, we start off in the capital Amman, we go down the old desert highway down to Petra. Now there's another route too, the King's Highway, and it comes close to the Dead Sea, as you can see, and then comes up the other route. Now this was the ancient land of the Edomite kingdom, a city that no white man had seen for over 1,500 years. Now, critics of the Bible story, they argued that the Edomite kingdom never ever existed. Then the spade of the archaeologists dug up some evidence from Egypt and from Iraq confirming the existence of this kingdom as an independent kingdom. Now today, the ancient territory of Edom is divided between Israel and Jordan. And Petra is the Greek name. It simply means rock, but it hardly prepares you for what you see when you go down there. Now, as you go down to Petra, you can come here to what they call the Spring of Moses, a traditional site from the Muslims, where they believe, Moses struck the rock and the water gushed out, But it's a spring there and inside this building that's still flowing today. And when more wet weather arrives, they would channel the water, including the spring water from here, down into Petra, so they got water inside the valley. Now, I'm telling you stories here from the 4 times I've been as we go through. On my first trip, back in 1995, our group stayed here at the Petra rest house just outside the ancient city. And there weren't too many sites outside to stay at back then. In fact, it was only the year before, in 1994, that Petra had over 100,000 tourists. But I went there again 10 years later, in 2006, and the accommodation had improved a little. And well, it might, because a year later, in 2007, they had 580,000 tourists. So tourism had just really gone up exponentially. The next year saw 800,000 tourists, and then in 2010 it hit a peak at about 900, nearly a million, 100,000. And when you consider, as I said, back in 1994, it was just the first time they had 100,000 tourists. Now prior to that, there wasn't any accommodation in the village outside. You would sleep in the tombs inside the valley. But today, Petra is now one of the new 7 wonders of the world, of the ancient world, and it's just a number 1 list of things to visit for anyone going into Jordan. Back just a couple of years ago, when I was there in 2019, I was impressed that the old Petra rest house was still there, although it's had some renovation. My 4th visit was in October, just a couple of years ago in 2023, and it's certainly a wonderful place to go. It just draws you back again and again, one of the 7 new wonders of the world. But it was in the early morning of my first visit, back in 95, that I walked up on a hill overlooking the track down into Petra, and here I saw the first glimpse of the wilderness, the wild, fantastic shapes of the hills that are like nothing else on earth. And I took the opportunity to read what the old Bible prophets had to say about this lost civilization of the Edomites. But nothing prepared me for the marvels that I would see that day. Now, as you go down, you pass what they call the obelisk tomb, which is a very faint prelude to the magnificent rock-cut tombs and temples you find inside Petra. And after about a kilometre, you come to the entrance of what they call the Seek, and it simply means the pass, because it's a narrow pass that enters into the open valley of Petra. And this is where the Wadi Musa would run through into Petra. Now you can see here there's a dam wall that's been built to stop the water flowing down the Seek. And it was originally built by the Nabateans in the 3rd, 2nd century BC to divert the flash flood water that would sometimes come down and rush through the Seek. And they wanted to divert it, and you can see it would go through a tunnel and it would enter into the Petra Valley from another route, but not through the Seek. It was repaired in modern times because, back in 1966, I think it was, 38 tourists lost their lives because of the flash flood rushing down that Seek. So they tried to divert it. Now the Seek is 1.2 kilometres long, and it's no wider than about 15 metres at its greatest width. And narrows in places where you can almost, but you can't, but almost reach out and touch both cliff faces on either side. And the colourful cliffs, they rise up on either side about 90 metres above your head, and in some places almost touch at the top. And much of the Seek is in a perpetual twilight with the occasional glint of the sun on the cliffs above you. And there's almost an eerie silence as you walk through, especially if you go when there's not many tourists about. You can hear the horses and their trot on the stones as they come through the narrow pass. And as you come along through the Seek, on both sides, mainly on the left-hand side, you can see a channel there that's been carved into the cliff face, and this was used to carry water from the spring of Moses and any other water that they would channel down into the cisterns and so forth inside the city. Now in these channels they would have terracotta pipes, you can see inset in the museum, they have these little terracotta pipes, and the descent of this water flow had to be at a very accurate rate of descent, because if it was too steep the pressure would build up and burst the pipes. But they were masters at water management, and they had this water coming in all the time. They were brilliant in managing water throughout Petra. It's actually a wonder that they could make a Garden of Eden out of a desert, as it really was, without water. They had dams, they had lots of water systems throughout Petra. They had pipes going all across the valley and in and out and so forth, guiding water to their pools and their baths and everything else in there. They literally turned a barren desert into a thriving city with gardens and everything else. Now you can see in places the remnants of a Roman road that once paved the Seek floor in the Roman era. So I'm just going to pause a moment, give you a minute or two to enjoy what it's like walking through the Seek. And I might ask if we can just turn this middle set of lights off. Thank you. Turn them, when I start again, only turn the back lights on, one's at the back. Okay. Well, then you turn a corner and that's what you see. And the change is almost so sudden it just about takes your breath away. Now, they call this a tremendous rock-cut temple El Khazna, which simply means the treasury. And it's the overpowering beauty and proportions of the treasury that amaze you as you take your first look at it. The beautiful shades in the rock, and it changes colour as the sun moves overhead. It's 27 metres wide, 40 metres high, or about the size of a 10 to 12 storey building. And there's absolutely no mistake in its perfect design. You see, in Egypt, if the builders made a mistake in their stone cutting, they just throw the stone away and do another one. But for the skilled stone cutters of Petra, there was no room for error at all. Now look at these beautiful designs. They can leave those middle lights off, thank you. But look at the beautiful design on these columns, and it shows a decided Greek-style capital or column from the Greek architecture. There's what they thought was an urn up the top, and it shows the evidence of many bullets being fired at it because Arab tradition felt that it was full of treasure. So they just shot at it to try to release the treasure inside. Now, this magnificent temple is believed to have been built in the 1st century before Christ, and certainly is a very Greek-orientated style of architecture. It's believed today that this beautiful carved temple was originally the mortuary temple of King Aretas III, a Nabatean king. Now, when you go inside, there's a large square room. Maybe it was perhaps used as a tomb. There's no inscriptional evidence. We don't know what it was used for. But it's a big square room, but it shows some of the beautiful colours in the Petra sandstone that you find throughout Petra. Now, looking back from the room inside, you're looking out of where the Seek comes out into the valley of Petra, and you can understand how this would be so easily defended. A whole army could be backed up through that Seek, but just a few dozen men would be able to hold them back from the entrance. A very impregnable fortress it was. In fact, Lawrence of Arabia visited Petra in 1917, and he called it the most wonderful place in the world. And wonderful it indeed is for everyone who goes there to see it. Now, this is a map, and it just shows us where we're heading in Petra. On the right-hand side is the entry gate, and you walk through the Seek, coming down, and then there's a few places. There's a high place of sacrifice. You come out in the open valley, and further up in the top left is another rock-cut temple we'll have a look at as well. But we're going to do a lot of walking in the hour we have together, and so I hope you're fit, because I'm going to get tired just telling you about it. So, walking past the treasury, you walk along in what is known as the Street of the Facades, and you have these facades of temples and so forth, these monumental Nabatean tombs carved into the southern cliff face. Then further along, you walk out into the open valley itself. And as you look around, everywhere you see along the cliffs, there are tombs everywhere. Hundreds and hundreds, about 800 around the place. And inside them is all this lovely coloured, sandstone, shades in the rock and so on. Now, if you get through the Seek, and by the way, you've walked about 2.5 kilometres just to get down here, down to the treasury, and if you're a bit tired from walking from the outside and down to the Seek and then through the Seek and so on, you can hire a camel and they'll take you into the open valley. Costs you a bit of money though, a few US dollars. And if that's too expensive for you, well, you can take hold of a donkey if you like. Plenty of those around, and believe me, after a day trekking through Petra, a beast of burden like this is a very attractive offer, no matter what the cost, I can assure you. Well, as you come out in the open valley, you come upon this Roman theatre built in the Roman times in the 1st century AD. It could seat 8,500 people. Romans loved their theatre. They built theatres everywhere they controlled the place. Now, it was the Romans that invaded the Middle East in 63 BC, and they controlled the trade route from Egypt going all the way up to Iraq in Mesopotamia, from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. And that's why they wanted to control the trade. They got the income that came through trade passing through Petra. So Emperor Trajan, in 100 AD, he built roads and shops, temples in the region. The largest structure was a Roman administrative centre. It's called the Great Temple, and it's the largest freestanding building inside Petra, used by the Romans when they took over in 100 AD. Now, in 1998, an excavation there revealed remains of a monumental swimming pool with, hydraulic systems for managing water and bringing water in and out and so forth. Channels and pipelines were discovered in there to water the pool and to irrigate a large earthen terrace to the north of the pool. So this is looking from the other side, and you can see that the temple on the right-hand side, or the administrative centre, and on the left was this garden and pool complex, and it must have looked amazing, in its heyday. A desert turned into a beautiful, place to visit. Now, it's believed the complex was constructed early in the 1st century during the reign of this King Aretas IV. Now, at its peak, Petra had a thriving population, probably about 20 to 30,000 people, inside a desert, mind you. But with water, it turns the desert into a Garden of Eden, and they were brilliant at that. Christianity entered Petra in the Byzantine era, from the mid-4th century to the mid-7th century AD, and there are some freestanding churches that are built inside Petra, and some tombs were converted into churches. But when the Romans shifted the trade route in the 4th century AD, Petra quickly began to decline in importance. And then in 363 AD, there was a great earthquake that destroyed many of Petra's buildings, and importantly, the earthquake just wiped out, more or less, the elaborate water system that they had within Petra. And it was just too difficult to rebuild and do it all, so it just fell into decline. By 700 AD, Petra was all but abandoned and became one of the lost cities until its rediscovery over 1,000 years later. Now, here's a map of what to see again in Petra, and everything shaded in brown is mountain. You've got to climb up there, and you come in from the gate, and the first place we visit is we'll climb up to the high place. It's the only high place of sun worship where they sacrifice to the rising sun in the Middle East. You read about this in the Old Testament, how when the Israelites came into the Promised Land, they were to destroy all the high places of sun worship. Only one escaped, this one here, in Petra. So you see the sign, the high place of sacrifice. So you've got to make the climb. I was already sweaty before he made the climb, by the way. That was in 2023. So as I said, I've been there 4 times, and every time it doesn't get any easier. It gets a bit harder. Well, I started my way up. My last time I went, I had a Polish guy with me. He was a translator. We did these meetings over in Poland, and he wanted to go to Petra. He'd been translating it for a number of times. He said, "Look, let's go and see it." So I did. But he had just had a hip replacement, and he wasn't climbing up nothing. So he said, "Mark, I want pictures. Get going." I didn't need them. I've been before, I told him. But anyway, up I went, and we went up. So as you climb, you get a nice view back down over the valley floor below. But you've got to keep on climbing and walking up. And it's hot, in Petra. I've been in various seasons. I went in October or November, and it wasn't too bad. But it's still hot work over there. Anyway, you keep on going up, and finally, after a hot, sweaty climb, you finally reach the top. And this is when I first got there, age 34, back in 1995. And you got there, the twin obelisks, they call it. When I was 6, just a couple of years ago, I got up there again. And I felt very good about myself, I can say, getting up there. But you know, these twin obelisks, they didn't sort of carve an obelisk and put it up in place. They carved out the rest of the hill or the mountain around it and left the obelisk. So they are there, and from there you can look across on the other hill or mountain, if you like. They call this the Jebel el Madbar, or the mountain of sacrifice. And this is where the high place is, just up there. So you do a bit more climbing further up, and up you go, and finally you reach the top, and there's a donkey waiting to be sacrificed. Well, it probably carried some poor tourist up there, you know, and he was having a rest before he went down again. Well, when I got up there in 1995, there was none of this up there. There was nobody up there. But now, you know, the Bedouin, they know how to make a dollar, and they know where to put all the drink places and the eskies and the whole lot. And you can go up there and have a 4-course meal just about in some of these places. And welcome to the view, it says. And I tell you what, it certainly is a view from up the top there as you look down on the open valley of Petra. And here is the place of sacrifice. This slab that's there, there's no inscriptional evidence. They don't know exactly what happened, other than it is a place of sun worship and sacrifice. But they believe that perhaps there was human sacrifice. So I had my guide in one of the trips that was in 1995. He was cutting my throat with a pen, so to speak. But there's no evidence of that at all. Probably it was sacrifice of goats that populate the area and so on. Here's a circular altar. It's in the shape of the sun, where the blood from the sacrifice would run down and so forth. They had a ritual pool, no doubt for ritual, you know, ceremonial washing and so forth with the blood sacrifices of various animals up there. And it's, as I said before, the only high place of sun worship in the Middle East that's left. And where they would get up there early, and the reason why they put them up high is when they wanted to catch the first rays of the rising sun to worship their God by offering these sacrifices. Now you ask, how did they discover Petra if it was lost for over 1,000 years? Well, it was the Swiss explorer, his name was John Burckhardt, who in 1812, he accidentally just came across the city. In 1809, he was commissioned by the African Exploration Association in London to explore the region south of the Sahara. And so to accomplish this task, he stayed in Damascus in Syria for nearly 3 years to accustom himself to the life and the religion and the language of the Muslims. So in 1812, he set out heading south toward the Gulf of Aqaba, and on the way, his guide talked about a strange deserted city near Mount Hor, where the Arabs had a traditional shrine to mark the supposed grave of Aaron, the brother of Moses. You can see it here in the picture. There. You can climb up there too, but I didn't, and I'm not going to. Well, to cut a long story short, Burckhardt convinced his guide that he had made a vow to sacrifice a goat within the site of Aaron's tomb. And this was a typical thing for the Arabs to do. And by the way, Burckhardt, he didn't look like an Englishman. They took him as an Arab. You know, he became an Arab just about. And so that was a common thing to do. So they took him in, and he saw these ruins of Petra. And he emerged to tell the world that the lost city of Petra had been rediscovered. No European had seen that city for about over 1,000 years until Burckhardt was led in there. So it had been discovered. Now we descend from the high place, and we've got to make a precarious descent down various stone steps and so forth. And on our way down, you come down a different route. You come to what's called the garden tomb. No doubt because there was brilliant water management here too, and gardens around these tombs are all well maintained and so on. We head down a little further and we come to what's called the soldier's tomb, and you can see Roman soldiers carved into the cliff face there from the centuries, the 1st century, 2nd century AD. And opposite that, they have what they call a triclinium, or a funerary banquet hall. And it's the only tomb, if you like, or interior that has a decorated interior where they've carved out columns and niches for the gods and statues and so forth like this. Now, after quite a walk, we make our way back down to the valley floor, and as you get down there, this is where all the restaurants are, and the cold drinks and all the rest of it, and you can refresh yourself down there. Now, from about the 3rd century before Christ, Petra was the capital of the Nabatean people that occupied this area. Now, the Nabateans, they were the descendants of Ishmael's eldest son, Nebaioth. So you got the Abraham and Sarah, and you follow that line down, you get Jacob, Rachel and Leah, and from that the 12 sons that become the 12 tribes of Israel. But Abraham, Sarah had a handmaiden, remember, Hagar. Their son was Ishmael, and his son was Nebaioth, and from Nebaioth came the Nabateans that occupied this area of Petra from the 3rd century before Christ. But before the Nabateans occupied this area, Petra was the stronghold of the Edomite civilization. Well, one of the strongholds of the Edomite kingdom. Now, there are 99 references to the kingdom of Edom in the biblical record, and importantly, the biblical record states that Edom was a powerful kingdom ruled by kings from at least the 15th century before Christ. Now, the Edomites, they were the descendants of Esau, who was the brother of Jacob, the twin brother of Jacob. So from Isaac and Rebekah, you had Jacob, and from them, the Israelites, and from Esau, the brother of Jacob, came the Edomites. So they were brother nations, the Israelites and the Edomites. And you remember the story of Jacob and Esau, how Jacob deceived his brother Esau out of his birthright. And you have the record here in Genesis. Esau said to Jacob, "Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary." Therefore, his name was called Edom. You see, Edom means red or ruddy, and this is how the Edomites received their name. So Esau dwelt in Mount Seir. Esau is Edom. And so Jacob and his descendants became Israel, and Esau and his descendants became the Edomites, the brother nation of the Israelites who dwelt here at Petra and other places. Now, notice what Numbers says here. This is going back to the time of Moses. Moses sent messages from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Now, Moses is 15th century BC, and he's saying there's an Edomite kingdom ruled by a king. So he sent a message to the king of Edom saying, "This is what your brother Israel says. You know all about the hardships that have come on us. Please let us pass through your country." And again they answered, "You may not pass through." Now, the Israelites were coming up from Egypt. And the first kingdom they found was the Edomite kingdom, living south of the Dead Sea, covering southern Jordan and part of southern Israel. And they wanted to pass through their territory, but they had a grudge, the Edomites, against their brother nation because of the deceitfulness of Jacob, you see. And these grudges go back centuries. But they wouldn't let them out, and they said, "You may not pass through." Then it says that Edom came out against them with a large and powerful army. So evidently, according to this historical record in the Bible, the Edomite had a large and powerful army and was ruled by a king in the 15th century before Christ. So Numbers 20 declares that there were kings in Edom capable of assembling a large army in the 15th century BC. Then you have, in the 10th century BC, these were the kings who reigned in Edom before any Israelite king reigned. Now, the first Israelite king was King Saul, and that's going back to the 10th century BC. Saul and then David and Solomon. So you have an Edomite kingdom then, even before the Israelite kings. And then you have perhaps this statement here. David became famous after he returned from striking down 18,000 Edomites in the Valley of Salt. And he put garrisons throughout Edom, and all the Edomites became subject to David. Now you have all this evidence in the Old Testament record. However, there was no evidence of the Edomites outside the Bible. And so before Petra was known to the modern world, skeptics of the Bible story said, well, you show us evidence that the Edomite kingdom ever even existed. And all the believer had was his faith in the Bible to rest upon, for initially there was no evidence anywhere that they had lived except for what these Bible prophets had said about this people. Now, the evidence of the Edomites was first discovered on top of this mountain inside Petra. They call it el Biara, which means the mother of cisterns, because they found some very large water cisterns, only with a hole in the surface of the ground like this, but inside a huge, like half this room size, big water cisterns in there to catch the rainwater whenever it rained up there. Now, we hired a Bedouin guide and we began to climb. And I tell you what, it is a certain, it's a decent climb. It's not for the faint-hearted. Takes a couple of hours to get up there at quite a very steep ascent. On our way, we passed what's called the unfinished tomb, and it shows you how they carved these tombs. So they started at the top, carved out a ledge, and they just carved their way down to the ground. That's how the treasury and some of these other great tombs were cut. Now, very few tourists go up on this Edomite mountain today. You can hike up there. You can go today. There's a track that take you up there, but most tourists only come for a day. They haven't got time to go to all these places, especially if it's going to destroy their legs climbing up there. Well, you make your way up the side of the mountain, and I went up in 95, and you go through a pass that once had a gate to block out any unwelcome guests, and in places the ascent was precariously close to the edge of the cliff, and it's a long way down. I thought to myself as I climbed up there, any army who could first get in and fight their way through that narrow seek and then climb this mountain and have enough fight left in them to overcome the Edomite stronghold would have been some army indeed. Well, it's a hot and it's a tiring climb. But finally, after close to 2 hours, we finally reached the top and we looked out over the region. And it was through this territory that the Israelites, when they left Egypt, sought to pass, the Edomite territory. They wanted to pass through this Edomite territory on the way up to Palestine and the Promised Land. But because of the grudge that the Edomites had against the Israelites and the deceitfulness of Jacob, they would not give Israel passage. Now, Crystal Bennett was a student of a famous archaeologist who excavated Jericho, Kathleen Kenyon. And Crystal Bennett was a pioneer of archaeological research in Jordan, and she conducted excavations at this Edomite site in Petra in 1958, 1960 and 1963. And on top of this mountain, she found a clay seal, what they call a bulla. Now, if you don't know what that is, it's about just a centimetre round. It's just a seal. They'd make a lot of documents, official documents and trade deals and all sorts of things, and they'd put a bit of straw around it and they would seal it with a little, like a signet ring, just a little impression, and that gave the authority as to who was commanding this, whatever it was. And they found this little seal, clay seal, of an Edomite king. She excavated at other Edomite sites, but she found no evidence of Edomites earlier than the 7th century BC. So what she found, this was a seal, and it mentions the king of Edom there, from the 7th century BC. And so all the scholars said, okay, we have Edomites, we have a kingdom in the 7th century BC, but all this story of a kingdom ruled by kings in the 15th century, that's a lot of myth and fable. Another Bible blunder. You can't believe it. Now, this is Google Earth, if you like, and this is the location of Petra, the Edomite stronghold, certainly of the 7th century BC. And further up was the capital of the Edomite kingdom in Bozrah. So we'll go up to Bozrah, and this is looking down on the ruins. There's a modern town there, but just there, there's not a lot of ruins, but they're the ruins of Bozrah, the capital of the Edomites. And it sits out overlooking the valleys, it's high up on a peak, sort of overlooking the steep valleys on each side there. And so we went to have a look at Bosra, the capital of the Edomite kingdom, and notice on the signboard, welcome to Basara, or Bosra. And it says there, welcome to Basara, the administrative and political centre of the kingdom of Edom, between 800 and 500 BC. Not any earlier. Now, it's very interesting that Israel Finkelstein wrote a book in 2001 called The Bible Unearthed, where he claimed that there is no evidence of the Edomite kingdom earlier than the 8th century BC. And he was quite correct in saying that. However, he was sceptical that there ever was an Edomite kingdom prior to the 8th century BC. And so this is what he said. Archaeological investigations indicate Edom reached statehood only under Assyrian auspices in the 7th century BC. Before that period, it was a sparsely settled fringe area inhabited mainly by pastoral nomads. Now, I've just read you the text going back to even the 19th century BC, Abraham, Moses, David in the 10th century, all these references of an Edomite kingdom ruled by kings, but Finkelstein says, no, that's wrong. They only existed as a kingdom from the 7th century BC. From Assyrian sources we know that there were no real kings, he said, and no state in Edom before the 8th century BC. Edom appears in ancient records as a distinct entity only after the conquest of the region by Assyria, he said. Now, here's the question then. Did the Edomite kingdom exist earlier than the 8th century BC? And that book, published in 2001, says no, they didn't exist at all. However, 1 year later, in 2002, excavations began at a site called Khirbet en Nahas, led by the archaeologist from Chicago, Thomas Levy, and the director of antiquities for Jordan, Mohammed Najjar. And they excavated between 2002 and 2009. And this is where they were. So you can see on our map the Gulf of Aqaba down there. You've got the Arabah Valley that runs up through the Dead Sea and north along the Jordan. You've got Petra there, and in this little circle is this site on the edge of the Arabah Valley. In the foothills, you've got this place called Khirbet en Nahas. And what that means is, the word simply means ruins of copper, because the Edomites were the masters of the copper industry of the ancient world. Now this site in Khirbet en Nahas, they've published it, was the largest copper smelting site in the ancient world, meaning ruins of copper. They found over 150 mine shafts surrounding the smelting site, in a radius of about 4 to 5 kilometres. Now, this was one shaft they showed me a couple of years ago, 40 metres deep. There are actually 3 holes. It looks like they've been drilled with a great big round drill, but anyway, they just went down 3 shafts, 40 metres deep, to get to the level of the copper ore. And this is some of the rubbish that was, tossed up over the top and so forth, but lying about was the copper ore. Now, I arranged a week with Dr. Mohammed Najjar. He's retired now, but he was very happy to take me to see their excavations and so on. By the way, this was just maybe not even a month after October 7, when everything happened in Israel, and all of a sudden, all tourists cancelled their trip to Jordan because they thought the trouble would spill over in the Jordan. And we were up in Poland. We had planned to spend 10 days in Jordan, and my associate was thinking, my translator was thinking, I don't know whether we should go. But we went anyway, and I'm glad we did, because we had everything to ourselves. There was hardly anyone around. And the Jordanian people, they love tourists. It's another country where all that was happening, so, there we were. And Mohammed Najjar led us around there. We spent a day with him on site there at Khirbet en Nahas. He showed us this 70-metre square walled fortress, and it was a fortress because copper industry, this was big money, this was big trade in the Middle East, and they had to protect their interests, and so they had this fortress here. And there were hundreds, plus about 100 other buildings around. I climbed on this great big slag heap, and this is the byproduct of smelting copper. And it's everywhere, and some of it, it's 10 metres deep. And you can imagine the amount of copper smelting done to produce the byproduct, which they just tossed off on a hill somewhere. They actually dug down here on this site here, 6 metres down, revealing 4 centuries of copper smelting. Now, in the slag, you have bits of charcoal and so on like that, and radiocarbon dating, which is not dealing with millions of years. When it's dealing with short amount of years, it's quite accurate. And they could date it from the 6th century to the 9th century. So the slag on top, 9th century BC. Further down, it got down to, up top the 6th century BC and further down the 9th century BC. And it's all sort of filled in now, but this is where they found some evidence of a long history of Edomite copper smelting here on this site. 24 hectares. Their evidence suggested that the Edomites were smelting copper from the 13th to the 9th century BC. They made ingots out of it. You can imagine now Israel Finkelstein saying there are no Edomite kingdom older than the 8th or the 7th century BC. Now you have this massive copper smelting site, 150 mine shafts all about, and that's only one smelting site, the biggest. There are others. You had to have all the workers digging the mines, bringing the ore out. You had to transport from the mine to the smelting site. Then all the people working on the smelting site, making high temperatures and doing. Then you had to have the trade, making these ingot, and a whole trade system around the Middle East. This is not by pastoral nomads, as Israel Finkelstein said. This is evidence of a kingdom, a statehood, controlling this massive trade. And there it is in the museum, some of these copper ingots that were used for trade and so on. Now this news, by the way, went all over the world. Washington Post, New York Times, everywhere. This is just one of them, where it says the new study under the direction of the University of California, Thomas Levy, contradicts much contemporary scholarship which had argued that because there had been no physical evidence, no Edomite state had existed before the 8th century BC. Until the current discovery, many scholars had said the Bible's numerous references to ancient Israel's interactions with Edom could not be valid. Now this is what gets me excited. When I go around and I see this for myself. They publish books, no, there's no Edomites, the Bible, big blunder in the Bible, you can't trust the Bible and on. Then the spade of the archaeologists dig stuff up which contradicts all of those statements. Here we have ancient kingdom of Edom, presumed to be a Bible story, could be real. Scientists have discovered evidence of an ancient kingdom previously thought to have been a mythical creation in the Bible. Here's another one. Archaeology confirms the book of Genesis on Israel's arch nemesis, the Edomites. And I was just enjoying speaking to archaeologist Muhammad Najjar, who told me Edomite dates have been pushed back 400 to 500 years to the 13th to the 9th century BC. And boy, didn't they come in for a bit of stick when the evidence came out, but it's irrefutable. Not only that, across over in Israel, which was also part of the Edomite territory, Israeli researchers identify the biblical kingdom of Edom as well, their presence over there. Under the leadership of Professor Ezra Ben Yosef of Tel Aviv University, he was excavating in the Timnah Valley from 2012 on, and he said, our results prove it happened earlier than previously thought, and in accordance with the biblical description, that is, the Edomite kingdom. He goes on and he says, our new findings contradict the view of many archaeologists that the Arava was populated by a loose alliance of tribes, and they're consistent with the biblical story that there was an Edomite kingdom here. Well, isn't that wonderful news? Well, I found it wonderful anyway, because every time someone pikes up and wants to scoff and call some sceptical thing and can't trust it, Bible blunders, you can't trust its history, then the spade of the archaeologist digs up evidence that proves all that false. And the Bible can be trusted, and its history is accurate. The book Obadiah in the 6th century BC says, "For your violence against your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever." And notice the power of this statement. "There shall not be any remaining of the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken it." Now these are brother nations, the Israelites and the Edomites, Jacob and Esau. There will not be any remaining of the house of Esau. And yet today there is probably more than 15 million now. I always have to change the numbers. But at least 15 million Jews in the world today, and they're still a distinct people. Tell me, how many have descended, how many can trace their heritage to the Edomites in the world anywhere? They're gone and gone forever, lost in the fog of history. And wonder of wonders, there isn't a single Edomite alive today. They were pushed out of their territory by the Nabateans in the 3rd century BC, and they became known as Idumeans, living to the south of Judah in New Testament times. And after that, they just disappeared into the fog of history. They're gone and gone forever. And as I said on our last night, you don't even have to be a believer to accept this, because a fact is a fact. But what I find quite amazing is that here you have these prophets who say these things, and you just have to accept it's true. You can't deny it, it's true. And then he goes on, Ezekiel in the 6th century BC, "Thus says the Lord God, because of what Edom did against the house of Judah, by taking vengeance, and has greatly offended, by avenging itself on them, therefore thus says the Lord God, I will stretch out my hand against Edom, I'll cut off man and beast from it, and make it desolate. And it will be a desolate wilderness," Joel says, and that's what it is. You can travel around the Arabah today. I mean, Petra is one site, but all the sites, they're pretty desolate. Just to the right of this picture is the Sikh entrance. You can see it here. The narrow Sikh entrance, just a thin cleft in the rock. And from the top of this Edomite mountain, I'm looking across, and you can see tucked away in another cleft of the rock, a magnificent rock-cut temple. I'm wondering if anyone can see it in the picture. There's my thing. Tell me where I should take my dot. Anyone? To the left? Tell me when to stop. Yep. Down. Keep going. There it is there, yeah. Let's go, there it is a little bit closer, carved out. Now, to get down from the mountain, where I took that picture, is another long climb down, and it's going to take about 3 hours hot and sweaty walking, going down and up again to see that marvellous temple. And I tell you what, I was absolutely whacked, I was just wasted. So let's just fly like a bird and get there quick. There it is. And as you turn a corner, you do the long walk up the mountain, and you turn a corner, and it almost takes your breath away. Just turn around a little knob in the rock, and there it is. It's 47 metres or 154 foot high, and 48 or 157 feet wide. And it's not as ornate as the treasury, but it's much bigger, a magnificent structure. And I saw a sign, and it said that, oh, bother, do I want to walk up there and see the best view in the world or what? And just because I thought, well, my audience would like me to do that, so I better go and do it. So I did it for your sake. Aren't I good? So I went up there and looked back on this wonderful structure. Now, in 1995, we had a real treat, because back then there was hardly any tourists. There were 2 Bedouins up there with an esky when we walked up there in 1995, and we were allowed to walk up the side. So that's me standing up the top there in 1995, And these are my colleagues taking a photo of me standing up the top, and I'm taking a photo of them looking down. And when you walk down the side, you get these wonderful side on. He's a friend of mine. We walked up the top, and you get these wonderful views side on. There I am, up the top, looking down at the other guys that are down the bottom there. Anyway, there was this Bedouin guy. His name is Abdul Meneb. He said, "Look, you want to see me do some tricks up there?" "Yeah? How much?" $20. All right, we paid him $20. Let's have a look at him. I call him the Tarzan of Petra. Bit of volume. Can you see him? As his heels are hanging over the edge there. I'm glad he wasn't afraid of heights. That's where he was. Can you believe this? He's jumping between the two. Now he's trying to climb up there. We literally thought the guy was going to kill himself. He told us he had a friend who would do a handstand up there, but he had fell 15 metres and bruised his ribs, so he wasn't doing it that day. Look at this. There you go. They called these fellas the flying men of Petra. They do acrobatics and everything up there. But I think workplace health and safety got to them and they don't do it anymore. Yeah. Well, you can imagine, after doing all this walking, climbing up 3 mountains, you can imagine the condition of my legs. I mean, I'm even feeling just talking about it. I met these Jordanian tourist police, and I almost asked them to call for a stretcher and carry me out of the place. I was about as wasted as this camel. And I would have rode him back, by the way, but he wasn't getting up for anybody. He had carried enough tourists for one day, so he said, "No, you can walk." So I had to walk. So, ladies and gentlemen, although my legs by this time were throbbing and my ankles and feet were aching and swelling, I carried on, undaunted, unstoppable, irrepressible and unrelenting and determined as ever to bring you, good people from Mount Gambier, a few more photos of this wonderful place called Petra. Aren't you appreciative of that? So, with my audiences on my mind, I climbed up yet another hill to photograph these magnificent rock-cut tombs. It was the poet Burgeon who wrote, "From the rock, as if by magic grown, eternal, silent, beautiful, alone." And at the end of a long and wearying day, I found myself almost alone in Petra, with the setting sun painting a picture too beautiful to forget. And then at last I entered a small rock-cut tomb, and what I saw made the aching pain in my legs all worthwhile. Now I knew why the poet Dean Burgeon called Petra the rose-red city. For the iron oxides in the Petra sandstone had painted pictures on tomb walls that left me in awe at what I was seeing. And for several minutes I forgot about my throbbing legs. After walking about 26,000 steps up and down Petra mountains, I just stood there marvelling at the natural beauty of Petra, the rose-red city. And I combed through the tombs, and I beheld with my own eyes the beauty of this wonderful city. So let's have a look at it. Let's have the back lights off as well. Thank you. Do you think my aching legs were worth it? Well, as I took my last look at Petra before making my 3-kilometre trek back through the Sikh, I couldn't help think of what the prophet Jeremiah said about this intriguing city. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Indeed, it shall come down on Edom. From generation to generation it will lie waste, and he shall stretch out over it the line of confusion and the stones of emptiness. Stones of emptiness. So it is today. No one lives in Petra today, but the Bedouins have their villages nearby. But when the last tourist leaves Petra under the setting sun, and I was about one of the last on my first visit there, Petra is shrouded in silence and emptiness. You know, I wish that every doubter, every unbeliever could stand where I stood in Petra and open the old book of God and read the words of the inspired pen of these prophets. Because I'm compelled to read the handwriting of God himself in the desolation and perpetual ruin that surrounds Petra and the territory of the Edomite kingdom. Stones of emptiness, said the prophet. And then a few verses later, it says these words, "Seek ye out of the book of the Lord and read. Not one of these will fail." Everything that it says will come to pass, in other words. Not one will fail. And so far, no skeptic has been able to prove it, that it has failed. Against Edom, thus says the Lord of hosts, Edom shall be an astonishment. Everyone who goes by it will be astonished, as when Sodom and Gomorrah and their neighbour cities were overthrown, says the Lord. No man will abide there, nor shall a son of man dwell in it. And so it is today. And as I carried my aching legs back towards the hotel, I couldn't help but be astonished at what I had seen that first time I visited Petra. Because for me, at 34 years of age back then, I saw the Bible come to life as these lost cities of the dead speak their silent testimony that the old book of God is indeed true and reliable. Sir Isaac Newton, the English mathematician, astronomer, physicist, formulated the laws of motion and gravity that most of us learnt about at school. But what most of us may not realise, that he was also a great student of the Bible. And his intelligent mind was captivated by the power of biblical prophecy. Listen to what this great scientist had to say about Bible prophecy. The design of God gave the prophecies of the Old Testament that after they were fulfilled, they might be interpreted by the event and his own providence be then manifested thereby to the world. For the event of things predicted many ages before will then be a convincing argument that the world is governed by providence. In other words, these prophets speak many ages before the event, and yet from history we can see how it's all been fulfilled exactly as they said. Don't even have to have any faith to accept it, because a fact is a fact. You just have to, that's true. But that then becomes a convincing argument that there's more behind this book than just a good story. In other words, fulfilled prophecy gives evidence of the divine origin of a book we call the Bible. Not many bouquets are thrown at the Bible today, but not many people know the evidence that is there today either. And I think what I'd like to put it to you as we continue on, the evidence is absolutely overwhelming. That when you take an unbiased look at it, it's overwhelming. So let me finish this first session with a poem, The Anvil of God's Word. Last eve I stood beside the blacksmith's door, heard the anvil ring its vesper chime. Then looking in I saw upon the floor old hammers worn with beating years of time. How many anvils have you had, said I, to wear and batter all these hammers so? Just one, he said. Then with twinkling eye, the anvil wears the hammers out, you know. And so the Bible, the anvil of God's word, for ages sceptic blows have beat upon, and though the noise of falling blows was heard, the anvil is unchanged, the hammer's gone. And so, from the people of Petra, and from a very wasted me, I hope you've enjoyed our first session this afternoon to Petra. We'll have a break for 10 minutes or so, and then we'll begin our next session at about 5 o'clock. Is that all right? All right. Thank you.